Welcome my channel. Tonight's story takes us into one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters of American history. This is the true account of America's most brutal slave hunter. The man linked to the destruction of 108 lives in just 1 year. This isn't folklore or exaggeration. It's built from plantation records, court notices, bounty logs, and eyewitness accounts that took serious time and cross-checking to uncover. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and make sure you subscribe, because digging up real, documented history like this takes a lot of work, and many of these stories were never meant to be remembered. In Mississippi in 1838, the rise of the man later whispered about as America's most brutal slave hunter didn't happen overnight. He didn't begin as a monster in the public imagination. He began as a solution. At the time, Mississippi's plantation economy was under strain. Enslaved people were escaping in growing numbers, slipping into swamps, forests, and river routes that plantation owners couldn't control. Laws existed, patrols existed, but fear existed too. Fear among slaveholders that the system they depended on was cracking. And into that fear stepped a man who promised certainty, control, and results. His name appeared first in courthouse notices and bounty advertisements, not in legend. He presented himself as a tracker, a specialist, someone who understood terrain, human behavior, and the desperation of those running for their lives. Plantation owners didn't see cruelty when they hired him. They saw efficiency. He offered contracts instead of favors, receipts instead of rumors. He charged per capture, per return, and eventually per punishment carried out. That shift alone tells you everything about how his reputation grew. He didn't just bring people back, he broke the idea of escape itself. At first, he worked locally. One county, one river bend, one plantation network. Word spread quickly because results spread quickly. Enslaved people who vanished were returned within days, sometimes hours. The swamps that once felt like protection became traps. Trails people believed were secret turned out to be known. Dogs were trained to follow not just scent, but silence. He studied patterns: who ran after harvest, who ran after punishment, who ran alone, who ran in pairs. He learned the rhythms of resistance and used that knowledge against it. Plantation owners began sharing his name like a warning. If they run, I'll call him. That threat alone reduced attempts at escape on some estates. Fear became his currency. He cultivated it carefully. He arrived unannounced. He stayed just long enough to be seen. He allowed stories to circulate, not because he told them, but because he never denied them. Silence made him larger than life. What made his rise different from other slave catchers was scale. Most worked intermittently. He worked relentlessly. 1838 wasn't just a year on the calendar, it was a campaign. He expanded his reach across counties, crossing plantation boundaries that normally kept enforcement local. He coordinated with sheriffs, jailers, and private owners. He carried letters of authorization that gave him freedom to act without question. In a system already built on violence, he was given permission to escalate it. Economic incentives fueled everything. Mississippi law allowed bounties for captured runaways, and owners were willing to pay extra for examples. Punishment became spectacle, not justice. The hunter understood that returning a person wasn't enough. The return had to echo. Each capture sent a message to dozens of others. Each message reduced resistance. That's how numbers climbed. That's how 108 lives could be destroyed in a single year, not only through capture, but through what followed capture. Enslaved communities knew his name before they knew his face. Songs changed. Routes changed. Some stopped running altogether. Others ran farther, deeper, choosing death over return. Elders warned the young not just about patrols, but about him specifically. If he finds you, they said, you don't come back the same. That reputation didn't come from exaggeration. It came from repetition. White society, meanwhile, rewarded him. Newspapers hinted at his effectiveness without naming his methods. Plantation ledgers recorded payments with chilling simplicity. Local officials looked the other way because his work reduced unrest. He became a tool the system relied on, but didn't want to examine too closely. The more brutal he became, the more valuable he was, and the more invisible his violence became behind numbers and contracts. By the end of that year, his rise was complete. He was no longer just a man, he was an institution, a living extension of the law, unrestrained by oversight. His name carried weight in courtrooms and terror in quarters. And yet, even at the height of his power, cracks were forming. The scale of his actions left traces. Bodies broken beyond repair, families erased, communities hollowed out. People began to whisper not just about his success, but about the cost. Keynote 1 isn't just about how he rose, it's about how a society built him. He didn't invent cruelty, he professionalized it. He didn't create the system. He perfected one of its darkest functions. His rise tells us something uncomfortable, that extreme brutality doesn't appear suddenly. It grows when fear is rewarded, when violence is profitable, and when humanity is reduced to numbers on a ledger. And in Mississippi in 1838, that combination created something history would later try, and fail, to forget. What truly separated this slave hunter from others of his time were the methods he used, not just to capture people, but to psychologically dominate everyone connected to them. His approach wasn't random violence, it was calculated terror. He believed fear worked best when it traveled faster than he did, and every technique he used was designed to leave a lasting impression long after he moved on to the next plantation. He began with tracking, and here he was disturbingly precise. He studied landscapes the way soldiers studied battlefields. Swamps, riverbanks, pine forests, abandoned trails. Nothing was unfamiliar to him. He learned how enslaved people moved when they ran, how they avoided open ground, how they doubled back through water to confuse scent, how they relied on stars, moss, and whispered directions passed down through generations. Then he turned that knowledge against them. He hired informants, often coercing poor whites or threatening enslaved people into revealing routes. Sometimes he didn't chase immediately. He waited. Hunger and exhaustion did part of the work for him. Dogs were central to his methods, but not in the way popular stories often soften. These animals were trained relentlessly, not just to follow scent, but to intimidate. The sound of barking alone could scatter entire groups, hiding in the woods. Survivors later said that once you heard the dogs, panic took over. People ran blindly, fell into traps, or exposed themselves trying to escape faster. He knew this. He counted on it. When capture happened, it rarely ended there. The return was the real performance. He understood that punishment done quietly was wasted punishment. Captured individuals were often brought back in daylight, sometimes dragged through multiple plantations before reaching their own. This wasn't accidental. It was a moving warning. People were forced to watch, to see what happened to those who tried to claim freedom. He didn't always carry out punishments himself. but he ensured they happened, and that they were seen. Restraints were another tool of terror. Shackles, chains, iron collars, devices designed not just to limit movement, but to humiliate. Survivors described being displayed in these restraints for days, sometimes weeks. The goal wasn't confinement, it was spectacle. It told everyone watching that escape didn't just fail, it followed you home. Psychological cruelty played an equally powerful role. He often separated people deliberately. Families were split during capture, with no explanation of where others were taken. Mothers returned without children. Husbands returned alone. The uncertainty destroyed hope more effectively than violence. In some cases, he would lie, telling captives that their loved ones had already been sold or killed. Whether true or not, the damage was done the moment the words were spoken. He also manipulated time. Some captives were returned immediately. Others vanished for weeks before reappearing broken and silent. No one knew what awaited them if caught. That unpredictability fed fear. It kept people from planning, from trusting patterns. Even silence became threatening, because silence meant he might already be close. Plantation owners often claimed ignorance, but records tell a different story. Many paid extra for discipline enforced. Some allowed him to operate without oversight, granting him full authority over captured people. That freedom made his methods increasingly extreme. There were no consequences, no limits, no accountability. His success protected him. Every capture justified the next escalation. What made his methods especially devastating was how they spread beyond his presence. Even when he wasn't there, his reputation enforced control. Overseers invoked his name to maintain order. Run, and he'll find you. That sentence alone stopped attempts before they began. Fear became decentralized, embedded in daily life. Enslaved communities adapted as best they could. Some changed routes constantly. Others refused to run in groups anymore. Some chose permanent hiding places deep in swamps, living half alive rather than risk capture. A few fought back, attacking patrols or dogs when cornered. Most paid for it with their lives. Resistance didn't disappear, it became more desperate. The tragedy is that these methods didn't just destroy individuals, they reshaped entire communities. Trust eroded. Silence replaced communication. Hope narrowed. The act of running, once a symbol of defiance, became almost unthinkable under the weight of his reputation. Keynote 2 isn't just about cruelty, it's about systematized fear. This slave hunter didn't invent violence, but he refined it into a strategy. Every method served a purpose: to capture bodies, to crush spirits, and to send a message louder than any law. And that message echoed far beyond Mississippi in 1838, leaving scars that didn't fade when the year ended, or when his name finally disappeared from the records. By the time the year 1838 came to a close, the number attached to this man's name had become almost unbelievable: 108 lives destroyed in a single year. Not captured, not returned, destroyed. That distinction matters because the damage went far beyond arrest or forced return. Each number represented a human being whose body, family, or future was permanently shattered, and often all three at once. The record didn't appear in one place. It had to be pieced together from bounty receipts, plantation ledgers, jail logs, medical notes, and court filings spread across multiple Mississippi counties. When those fragments are placed side by side, a grim pattern emerges. The count included men, women, teenagers, and children. Some were repeat runaways, already marked as trouble. Others had fled once, driven by a single act of desperation, a beating, the sale of a child, the threat of separation. The hunter did not distinguish between them. To him, they were entries on a list. Each capture was documented with chilling efficiency: date, location, condition upon return, payment received. In several cases, notes added later recorded deaths that followed within days or weeks, infections, internal injuries, sudden collapse, or simply expired. What makes the number so horrifying isn't just how high it is, but how quickly it accumulated. There were weeks where he returned multiple captives within days of each other, moving from plantation to plantation with relentless momentum. The pace suggests more than individual pursuits. It suggests organized campaigns. He wasn't reacting to escapes, he was anticipating them. In some regions, any disappearance triggered an immediate response. He was summoned before families even realized someone was gone. Some of the 108 never made it back alive. Official records rarely say this outright, but the gaps speak loudly. Names appear in wanted notices and bounties paid, yet no return entry follows. In a few cases, medical examiners noted bodies found in swamps or along riverbanks shortly after his patrols passed through. No cause was listed. No investigation followed. Those lives were counted not because justice acknowledged them, but because absence left a trail. For those who were returned alive, survival did not mean recovery. Plantation records often noted a drastic drop in productivity following their return. People once listed as able-bodied were reclassified as damaged, unfit, or limited, broken bones that healed wrong, lungs ruined from exposure, wounds that never closed properly. Some were sold off quickly afterward, their bodies no longer profitable. Others were kept as warnings, living examples of what escape cost. Families absorbed the damage too. A single capture often destroyed multiple lives at once. Children left without parents, spouses separated permanently, entire family units erased from records after a return, suggesting forced sale or death soon after. In several instances, plantation ledgers show multiple entries from the same family line disappearing within months. That's how destruction multiplies: one pursuit, many victims. The hunter himself kept meticulous records, but only for what benefited him. Payments received, miles traveled, dogs fed, injuries sustained, his own. There is no indication he tracked outcomes beyond his compensation. That indifference is part of what allowed the number to climb so high. There was no incentive to slow down, no penalty for excess. Success was measured only in results delivered, not lives ruined. Local authorities knew. Jailers signed intake logs. Sheriffs approved transfers. Doctors treated injuries without question. Ministers sometimes recorded burials without sermons. This wasn't hidden brutality, it was normalized. The number 108 didn't shock officials, because the system had trained them not to see people in it. They saw property recovered, order restored, deterrence achieved. Among enslaved communities, however, the number spread like wildfire. Not as a statistic, but as a warning. People counted differently. They counted who didn't come back the same, who never came back at all, who stopped speaking, who stopped running. By mid-year, some plantations reported no escape attempts at all, not because conditions improved, but because fear had done its job. What's especially chilling is how the count likely understates the truth. It includes only those documented through formal channels. It does not include those who died in hiding, drowned while fleeing, were killed by dogs, or vanished into swamps and were never found. It doesn't include the children who died later from trauma, the elderly who gave up after losing family, or the ripple effects that carried forward for generations. The true cost can't be measured, only estimated. By the end of 1838, the hunter's reputation was sealed. He was spoken of not as a man, but as an outcome. If he was involved, destruction followed. Plantation owners referenced his numbers with grim approval. He gets results. But results for whom? Stability for the system, profit for owners, and devastation for everyone else. Keynote 3 forces us to confront the danger of numbers without humanity. 108 lives reduced to a tally. A year of suffering condensed into a statistic. This wasn't chaos, it was efficiency weaponized. And the fact that such a record could exist, be rewarded, and then quietly fade from public memory tells us something deeply unsettling. That when cruelty aligns with power and profit, even mass destruction can be written off as routine. By 1838, plantation owners across Mississippi no longer saw this slave hunter as an option. They saw him as a necessity. Their dependence on his brutality grew quietly but completely. Escapes threatened more than property. They threatened authority, profit margins, and the illusion of total control. And when fear began to slip, they turned to someone who promised to restore it fast. He didn't just bring people back. He restored obedience. That's why they paid him so well, protected him so fiercely, and rarely asked how he got results. Plantation ledgers from the period reveal a disturbing pattern. Payments to this hunter were often listed separately from routine expenses, marked as security, recovery, or discipline. The amounts increased as his reputation grew. Owners paid bonuses for speed, for secrecy, and for example made. Some contracts included clauses that rewarded him not only for capture, but for preventing future escapes on that plantation. In other words, fear itself became a service. And he delivered it reliably. Owners shared information with him freely. They gave him names, habits, family connections, even rumors about planned escapes. In doing so, they became collaborators, not bystanders. They allowed him to interrogate enslaved people without oversight. They permitted nighttime raids, cross-plantation chases, and temporary detentions that stretched the law to breaking point. When questions arose, injuries too severe, deaths too sudden, owners closed ranks. Losing a laborer was unfortunate, losing control was unacceptable. The rewards weren't just financial. He was given social protection. Sheriffs expedited paperwork. Jailers made space. Doctors treated his dogs before human captives. When complaints surfaced, they were dismissed as exaggerations or necessary measures. In a society that valued order above life, his violence was reframed as responsibility. He wasn't cruel, he was effective. That word followed him everywhere. Some plantation owners went further, using him as a symbol. They would arrange his arrival during daylight, making sure enslaved people saw him dismount, saw the dogs, saw the chains. No punishment needed to occur that day. His presence alone did the work. Owners learned that terror, once established, was cheaper than constant enforcement. One visit could suppress resistance for months. This dependence changed plantation culture itself. Overseers became harsher, knowing a specialist could clean up the aftermath. Owners became bolder in threats, invoking his name casually. "Run, and I'll send for him." That sentence became as powerful as a whip. In some places, escape attempts dropped sharply, not because people were content, but because hope had been strategically crushed. The rewards escalated accordingly. He received land access others didn't. He stayed in the main house, not the quarters. He was fed, armed, and housed at the owner's expense. In some cases, owners pooled funds to retain him exclusively during peak seasons, when escapes were most likely. This wasn't law enforcement anymore, it was privatized terror, tailored to protect wealth. What's most revealing is how owners reacted when he wasn't available. Panic set in. Letters from the period show owners urgently requesting his services, complaining when he was delayed, offering higher pay to secure his return. Their fear mirrored the fear they imposed. They had built a system that required escalating violence to sustain itself, and now they were trapped by it. And yet, they maintained distance when history might judge them. Rarely did an owner record what happened after a capture. Rarely did they note injuries in detail. Deaths were attributed to fever, accident, or decline. This selective blindness allowed them to benefit from brutality without claiming ownership of it. The hunter absorbed the moral weight. He became the face of violence they authorized but didn't want to see. Enslaved people understood this relationship clearly. They knew the hunter didn't operate alone. They knew who summoned him. They knew which owners paid extra, which ones demanded severity. Trust eroded not just toward the hunter, but toward every authority figure connected to him. Even small acts of kindness from owners were viewed with suspicion, because the threat always loomed. Over time, this dependence poisoned the system it was meant to protect. Productivity suffered as trauma spread. Skilled laborers became broken laborers. Families shattered meant instability, not efficiency. But owners ignored these costs because the immediate goal, control, was achieved. Long-term damage was someone else's problem. Keynote 4 exposes an uncomfortable truth. The hunter's brutality was not an aberration. It was a service demanded, funded, and rewarded by those in power. He didn't terrorize Mississippi on his own. He was enabled by a network that valued obedience over humanity and profit over life. And as long as that network paid, protected, and praised him, the violence continued, not in secret, but in plain sight, written quietly into ledgers and justified as business as usual. By the time his name began circulating in whispers, fear had already taken root long before he arrived. Enslaved communities didn't need posters or announcements to know when he was near. The signs came first: dogs heard miles away, overseers suddenly tense, patrols doubled at night, fires ordered extinguished early, mothers pulled children close. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even elders who had survived decades of bondage understood that this was a different kind of threat. This wasn't routine punishment. This was eradication. His reputation traveled faster than he did. Stories spread along riverbanks, through work songs altered to carry warnings, through coded phrases shared at wells and fields. People spoke of how he tracked by memory, how he questioned neighbors, how he punished not just escape, but the idea of it. The fear he generated wasn't limited to those who ran, it consumed everyone connected to them. Family members were interrogated. Friends were watched. Entire quarters were punished for the actions of one. In this way, fear became communal, shared like an illness that no one could escape. Resistance didn't vanish, but it changed shape. Open defiance became rare. Instead, people learned silence. They learned to hide grief, to bury plans deep, to communicate without words. Eyes replaced speech. Small gestures carried enormous meaning. The presence of the hunter forced resistance underground. where it survived in fragments, a tool misplaced on purpose, a task slowed just enough to matter, a warning passed at great risk. Survival itself became a form of defiance. Nighttime was the worst. Darkness should have offered cover, but with him involved, it became a trap. People slept lightly, fully dressed, ready to run at the slightest sound. Children were trained not to cry. Elders kept watch. Not because they believed they could stop him, but because knowing was better than being surprised. The psychological toll was relentless. Fear didn't come and go. It stayed, pressing down day after day, turning exhaustion into a constant state. What made this terror especially effective was its unpredictability. Sometimes he struck quickly. Sometimes he waited. Sometimes he took one person. Sometimes he took many. There was no pattern to rely on, no behavior guaranteed to keep someone safe. Obedience didn't promise protection. Loyalty didn't matter. Innocence offered no shield. This randomness shattered any illusion of control and made fear self-sustaining. People policed themselves because the alternative felt worse. Even those who never encountered him directly were changed by his shadow. Children grew up hearing his name before they learned to read. They absorbed caution before curiosity. They learned limits early, internalizing boundaries imposed by terror. For many, the world narrowed permanently. Dreams of escape faded, not because freedom wasn't desired, but because the cost had become unthinkable. The system didn't need constant violence anymore. The memory of it did the work. There were moments of resistance, though they were rarely recorded. Some communities messled him deliberately, feeding false trails, sacrificing livestock tracks to confuse dogs, sending runners in opposite directions. These acts were dangerous and often punished, but they reveal something important. Fear never fully erased courage. It just raised the price. Every decision carried weight. Every step was measured against the lives of others. Resistance became an ethical calculation, not an impulse. The hunter understood this dynamic well. He exploited it. He used fear as leverage, threatening consequences not just to individuals, but to entire families. He made examples publicly when possible, not because it was necessary, but because it was efficient. One visible act could ripple through hundreds of lives. Silence afterward was interpreted as success, and plantation owners mistook that silence for order. But beneath the surface, the damage accumulated. Trauma manifested in illness, in sudden breakdowns, in people who stopped speaking altogether. Work slowed. Trust eroded. Communities fragmented under pressure, not because bonds were weak, but because fear forced impossible choices. Protect yourself or protect others. Speak or stay silent. Run or stay and risk everyone. There were no good options, only less catastrophic ones. This fear also reshaped how enslaved people viewed authority. Overseers, patrols, even owners became extensions of the hunter's reach. Any request felt like a test. Any kindness felt suspicious. The threat blurred lines between individuals and institutions, turning the entire system into a single looming presence. It wasn't just one man anymore. It was a feeling that followed people everywhere. And yet, despite everything, fear did not fully succeed in what it was designed to do. It did not erase memory. It did not erase longing. Songs still carried hope beneath coded warnings. Stories still circulated about places beyond Mississippi, about people who made it out, about freedom that existed even if it felt impossibly distant. The hunter could suppress action, but he could not extinguish thought. Keynote 5 reveals the deepest cruelty of his legacy, not just the lives directly destroyed, but the generations shaped by terror. Fear became an inherited condition, passed down through behavior, silence, and caution. It altered how people loved, planned, and trusted, and that impact lasted far longer than his physical presence ever did. The hunter eventually left or fell from power, but the fear he spread lingered, woven into memory, carried forward by those who survived, and remembered long after his name was meant to be forgotten. As suddenly as his influence had spread, the end of his reign did not arrive with a public reckoning or dramatic justice. It came quietly, wrapped in uncertainty, half-records, and deliberate omissions. One year his name appeared constantly in ledgers, contracts, and whispered warnings. The next it began to fade. Payments stopped. Requests went unanswered. Plantation letters mentioned delays, confusion, and frustration. Then nothing. No announcement. No trial, no obituary anyone could find. Just absence. There were rumors, of course. In Mississippi, absence always bred stories. Some claimed he was killed during a pursuit that went wrong, ambushed in swampland by people who refused to run anymore. Others believed he was poisoned slowly, over weeks, by someone who worked close enough to him to avoid suspicion. A few whispered that he turned on the wrong plantation owner, pushed brutality too far, and was quietly removed by the very system that once protected him. None of these stories could be proven. That was the point. Official records offer little clarity. Court documents from the period show no charges, no warrants, no inquests tied to his name. Sheriff logs that once tracked his movements suddenly stop mentioning him. Plantation accounts list replacement services and new arrangements, never explaining why. It's as if he was erased deliberately, scrubbed from paper before history could ask questions. In a society skilled at burying inconvenient truths, this silence speaks loudly. What is clear is that his disappearance caused panic among those who depended on him. Letters survive from plantation owners complaining of increased resistance, escapes, and unrest. Some begged neighboring counties for recommendations, asking who could handle matters with similar efficiency. Others admitted privately that no one else inspired the same level of fear. His absence created a vacuum that couldn't easily be filled. Violence, once centralized through him, became scattered and less controlled. For enslaved communities, the shift was felt almost immediately. The terror didn't vanish overnight, but something changed. The constant pressure eased, just enough to be noticed. Patrols grew less coordinated. Dogs were heard less often. Threats lost some of their power without his name behind them. People were cautious, unsure whether this was a temporary lull or something permanent. Hope returned slowly, carefully, like a limb waking up after numbness. Still, no one celebrated openly. History had taught them that danger could return without warning. Many believed he would come back. They told children to stay alert. Elders warned against trust. The fear he built had momentum of its own. Even gone, he lingered in habits, in silence, in instinctive flinches at certain sounds. His reign ended physically, but psychologically it dragged on. Plantation owners responded in telling ways. Some attempted to downplay his role, rewriting narratives to suggest order had always been maintained without excess. Others quietly destroyed correspondence tied to him. A few shifted blame onto overseers or patrols, spreading responsibility thin to avoid scrutiny. No one wanted to be associated with a figure whose brutality might someday be questioned by a changing world. There is also evidence that local authorities were relieved by his disappearance. While they benefited from his work, he was a liability. His methods blurred legal boundaries too openly. Injuries were too severe, deaths too frequent. Whispers of federal attention, especially as national tensions rose towards civil war, made men like him dangerous to protect. Removing him without explanation was safer than defending him publicly. One chilling possibility remains, that he was absorbed into anonymity. Some men like him didn't die, they simply moved on, changed names, crossed state lines, rebranded themselves as guides, guards, or security men elsewhere. In a country expanding rapidly, reinvention was easy, especially for someone already operating in moral darkness. If this is true, then his end was not an end at all, just a relocation of violence. What history does record is the deliberate forgetting. Later accounts of Mississippi's slavery often speak in generalities, avoiding specific names or numbers. The figure responsible for 108 destroyed lives in a single year becomes an abstraction, his actions folded into a vague system rather than attached to a person. This dilution protects reputations. It softens guilt. It allows descendants to say, "That was just how things were," instead of, "This is what we funded." For the people who survived him, forgetting was never an option. Even as years passed, stories remained, passed quietly, carefully, so they wouldn't attract punishment. Names might change, details blur, but the shape of the fear stayed intact. Children grew into adults who remembered what happened when one man was allowed to operate without limits. They carried that knowledge forward, not as myth, but as warning. His reign ended without justice, without acknowledgement, and without apology. That in itself is part of the story. Systems built on exploitation rarely punish their most useful instruments. They discard them when convenient and erase them when dangerous. The hunter served his purpose, then vanished into the same shadows he once used to hunt others. Keynote 6 exposes the final cruelty of his legacy. Not just that he escaped accountability, but that history tried to erase him entirely. Yet Erasure failed, because even when records go silent, consequences remain. The fear he spread reshaped lives. The violence he normalized outlived him, and the unanswered question of how such a man was allowed to operate and then simply disappear still hangs over Mississippi's past, demanding to be remembered, even when the system tried its hardest to forget.